Okay, Erev Tov. So we started mentioning, without really getting into it, and today we'll really get into it, into Bible criticism and what we gain from Bible criticism, and we will gain more later on as we go along. We mentioned the name of Mordechai Breuer. We'll get back to him. One second. Before we do that, we'd like to relate to two questions. I'd like to relate to two questions that were raised last week or 2 weeks ago. One of them, not a question, a point raised by Don, that you had a shiur with Rav Liebtag about I think you mentioned the names of Hashem as part of the shiur in Bereshit, or all about Sefer Bereshit. So we're not going to get to it today. We'll get to it later on. But one of the examples that we will discuss will be the attitude of the way that Sarah treats Hagar. And that is mentioned in two different chapters, two different times in Sefer Bereshit. And the name of Hashem is one of the differences between the two stories. And I have an opinion or a commentary or an interpretation of what could be the meaning and the significance of that in that story. And I would be very interested, Don, to know if you heard anything from Rav Liebtag on that specific story, if you remember, or if you have it written down, but it won't be today anyhow. You're all muted, so if you want to say something, unmute yourself.
I would probably have to look back through my notes.
Okay, so I'm giving you at least a 2-week notice, if not more. But you know, if you could look through your notes, it's I think Perek Tet Zayin and Kaf Aleph, something like that. It's in probably in Lech Lecha and Vayera. If you have anything about that. Thank you, Eliezer. We didn't have time 2 weeks ago, and you mentioned two things that I'd like to relate to. Things that for you said make it difficult or have a difficulty with Torah min hashamayim. One of them was about Moshe saying about himself that he's modest. We're all muted, Eliezer, so if you want to say something.
I didn't mean from Hashamayim, I meant from Sinai.
From Moshe?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of them was Moshe saying that he is the most modest person on earth. And I'd like to say that for me is not a problem at all. I don't think there's any, I think it's an interesting moral issue. I don't think it's a question of, could it be that Hashem says to him, or that he says something like that in his Torah that's given through him, by him. I don't really see a difficulty with that. I don't think it's similar to the second question, which we'll get to in a moment. In fact, I would dare say just that there are some modest people in the world, and there are even modest people who teach about modesty, meaning any sage, any wise person in Judaism or in any other religion or moral path who taught about modesty, about anava, was saying, I know something about modesty. So I can tell you something about modesty. And I don't think it's immodest to say, I can tell you about modesty. And I don't think it's immodest for a person to say, I am very modest, if he's not saying it for the prize, because they're giving out a prize to the most modest person around. So he enters the contest, but because he wants to say something to teach people about modesty. So I don't think it's that kind of a question. It's a question of the moral fiber of saying it, but I don't think it's a question of being able to be given Mishamayim or Misinai or Mimoshe and things like that. And it's very different than the second question. I'll just mention the second question because Michael wants to say something, but I'll just first mention the second question was, you said about things there where the Torah says, something which seems to suggest that it's being said much later on, like it says, Ad hayom hazeh. And we will relate to that twice today in two different ways, but in a moment. First, Michael, what did you want to say?
Well, just make sure I'm understanding this properly. I can see where somebody would read the statement that Moses was the most humble man that ever lived and say, well, he's really full of himself. But as I understand it, he didn't make that up. He's more of a stenographer than the author of the book. We consider Hashem to be the author of the book, yes? So if he's instructed to write that down, how do we criticize him for that?
Yeah, but I agree with you, but I would add that, first of all, even as a stenographer, it's a very inconvenient place to be, to say I won the modesty prize.
Yes.
But I was told to write it, so please forgive me. But I think it's deeper than that. I think it's really okay, because it's not about, modesty can be understood not about getting points for something, but about teaching a certain trait. I didn't, but let's say I used to smoke. I stopped smoking. Now I have a whole company that teaches people how to stop smoking. I used to get very angry, and I taught myself how to stop getting angry, and I have a whole method. And please, I created a whole institution, and I taught people, and I'm the head of the institution. We teach everybody how to overcome and learn not to get angry and so on. How different is that? And I was a very haughty person. I taught myself how to be modest, and I created a school, and I taught other people, and I have a whole organization that teaches people modesty. I'm doing something good for the world. I'm not saying, please give me a prize. I want the Israel Prize on Yom Ha'atzmaut for, what do you call it in English? A mif'al chaim, but I'm doing something good for the world. So I don't really see a problem with it. I understand the sensitivity, but I don't think philosophically it's an issue.
But the Gemara says that the 8 psukim were written by Yoshua.
Wait, we didn't get to that yet.
Oh,
That's the next issue.
apologize.
That's the next issue. And one more thing about modesty is I thought that's what you were going to say, Tova, when the Gemara says, the Mishnah, the Braita in Masechet Sotah says that there were all kinds of sages, and when each sage died, some trait died with him, and when someone died, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi died, the trait of modesty died with him. By the way, he was very rich and a very glorified person. Doesn't mean that in his inner traits he wasn't a modest person, but there's a sage in the Gemara named Rav Yosef who says that's not true because I'm still here. He really says that. So again, it can be perceived as, as a joke, but I think it's serious. I think he's saying, it's not, maybe I'm not the most modest. I didn't say that I'm competing with Moshe Rabbeinu, but I have something to say about modesty. It's not void in the world. So I think it's okay. The issue of Ad Hayom Hazeh, I would say, is a serious question, because it says in the Torah, in Tanakh, Ad Hayom Hazeh. What does Ad Hayom Hazeh mean? If it only means till Moshe Rabbeinu, what does it mean? And it's also a question in other places in the Torah, and we will get to that. Will be part of a major part of what we want to do this evening. And I would say about this one, I would say you're right. Apparently, it means that there are places in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, where a later prophet added something into the book to the level of 3 words, Ad Hayom Hazeh, or something that is updated a few hundred years later, being able to say Ad Hayom Hazeh. There are sages who accept this, who recognize this. We don't always like to talk about it and publicize it and so on, meaning they have the prophetic permission, have the prophetic authority to put in a few words here and there and things like that are not making any substantial change in the message of the Torah, and that's okay. And as you mentioned, Tova, one of the examples, or one of the main examples for this, is the last 8 psukim of the Torah that the Gemara discusses, because who wrote them? Why the last 8 psukim? Because the 8th pasuk to last says, Vayamot Sham Moshe. Moshe died. So who's writing these words that Moshe died, and that the people of Israel mourned Moshe after his death, and that there was no greater leader for the Jewish people than Moshe Rabbeinu. These psukim are very important, the end of the Torah, because they're saying that a future prophet cannot come and argue with Moshe Rabbeinu. He can't come and say, Hashem gave me a prophecy that now we're changing from Shabbat to Sunday. And those of you who remember our friend Shlomo Brunel, who was a Lutheran minister, and we asked him to tell his story of conversion. One of the things he said, he grew up on the combination of the Old Testament and the New Testament until he started seeing discrepancies, like if the Old Testament says Shabbat and no changes in the Torah, so why are we doing Sunday? So he said, I'm going back to Shabbat. I'm going back to the original. So that's part of, there's no one like Moshe, but who wrote that? So there are a few options in the Gemara. One of them is that Yoshua wrote it. And I'd like to tell you, the Ibn Ezra calls it Sod HaShnei Masar. What is Sod HaShnei Masar? The secret of the 12. What's the secret of the 12? The secret of the 12 is that it's not 8 psukim, it's 12 psukim. Because the last chapter, the last 12 psukim of the Torah begin with Vaya'al Moshe. Moshe went up to the mountain where he's going to die, and no one knows where he's buried. So from that point on, when Moshe goes up, who's writing this? If it's Moshe writing it, so he went up, died, came back to give us the 12 psukim and went back up again. What does it mean? So the Ibn Ezra says it's not 8 psukim, it's 12 psukim. And there's a secret here, and the secret apparently is that, yes, there can be some small details that are added according to the prophetic authority that they can add that doesn't make a substantial change in the Torah and so on. But because it's uncomfortable for people to deal with it, we're going to keep it a secret. So it's called Sod HaShnei Masar. And he mentions places where it says Ad Hayom Hazeh. And I'd like to show you this book, which the name of the book is, this is Rav Amnon Bazak from the Gush. And Ad Hayom Hazeh is one example. It's a good example because it's short enough to give as a headline for the book, as a title for the book. It deals with questions of Tanakh, of how can it be, of Bible criticism, of archaeology, history criticism, of Ad Hayom Hazeh, and things like that. And he has a whole chapter. The book includes 10 chapters. Chapter number 2 is 32 or 33 pages long. It's about later psukim that have been added to the Torah. And if you want to read the book, I don't know that it exists in English. I recommend it very much. Find a bilingual chavruta who can learn it with you in Hebrew and English together. It's an interesting book, I think. And he never says, please, it's better if you don't ask these questions. His attitude is always, let's deal with the questions. If you look at his introduction to the book, that's one of the points he's making. We are not shying away. We are not running away from the questions. We're not hiding them. It's better to deal with them in this day and age when everything is open. And if you don't deal with the questions, you're going to have people with questions without any tools to deal with them. It's better that we face the questions and deal with them and give people tools to deal with them rather than try to make believe they don't exist. So I'm not going to get into the whole chapter. It's a 30-plus page chapter. If you're interested, you can find that chapter in this book. But I would say, of course, it raises a question. So how would I know it's 3 words and not 30 words and not this and not that mitzvah? I agree that there could be a question there, but it's, again, it goes back to being a question. I can't prove anything. It goes back to being a question of Emunah and accepting that a later prophet can update the main message of the story in the Torah by saying, yes, Ad Hayom Hazeh, even to this day. So if you're willing to accept that, that's an answer to this question. And if you're not willing to accept that, then to deal with it in a different way. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, you have to read the chapter in the book. Yes, Eliezer.
I would sort of go along with Rambam, and in the sense that there are basic truths, basic principles of Judaism, and one goes on from there, because it bothers me to say, well, you have to believe that this was dictated in this form because it doesn't make sense. Look, anything's possible, right? Because Kadosh Baruch Hu could do anything. But for us to say that Hakadosh Baruch Hu did these because it's more convenient for us to believe, or something like that, that bothers me. And that's why actually I like what you just said, that you start with the principle that the Torah came from Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and the principles are immutable. But you work from there and say, well, if the kings of Edom were listed in the Torah when they hadn't even been born for 1,000 years or something like that,
There is
you could say that that perhaps was a tag on, because it doesn't affect the message of the Torah or the truth of the Torah.
I would just add, with agreeing with you, I would just add that, first of all, the basic principle is that the Torah is God-given, based on prophecy, and it moves on to the Torah not being changed. And when the Rambam says that, it's clear that the Rambam is struggling against Christianity and Islam and so on. And that's what's important. And the having the words Ad Hayom Hazeh or something like that is not the important part of the battle that the Rambam is waging there with Christianity and Islam. And I would add another thing, that the Rambam presents 13 principles of faith. They are clearly based on 3 principles. The 3 principles are belief in Hashem, I would say a higher power, because Hashem is already putting it within a certain framework. And the other is believing in Torah min hashamayim, and the third is in reward and punishment, which comes to the point of Mashiach and Olam Haba and things like that. And the fact that the Rambam detailed it into 13 different principles does not mean that this was given, the statement, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe, but it doesn't make the Rambam like Moshe Rabbeinu, and certainly the Rambam would agree that he's not Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rambam's basic principles are agreed in Jewish, in the history tradition of Jewish thought, but the details of all 13 principles are not, don't have to be agreed upon on every small, fine note of those principles. So I'm not sure the Rambam would disagree, but even if he does, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to compare the Rambam to Moshe Rabbeinu. We shouldn't.
Nachmanides said, Nachmanides, Ramban, that the Torah was written Parshiot. As things happened, they were written down.
That's a machloket in Chazal.
Right. So, but that makes sense, because if somebody had to write down the whole thing from the very beginning, or be dictated to, that wouldn't make sense.
But you have to look at both opinions there. There's a machloket about it. I would try and see the logic. I don't want to get into it right now. I'm not even there myself.
Okay.
What is the logic of each of the 2 sides of that argument? I would lean, I would, my natural leaning is towards what you're saying, but I would have to look into that as an issue in itself. Okay. Yes, I'd like to move on to discuss a little bit. Sorry, Ilana?
I just wanted to apologize for being late.
Okay. Apology accepted. We're not throwing you out. You can stay. I'd like to move on to discuss a little bit of Bible criticism. We discussed 2 weeks ago, we discussed the literary analysis of the Torah. By the way, we discussed a little bit about counting numbers and letters and things like that. One thing I would say beyond the discussion we had about it 2 weeks ago, one thing I would add is Rav Samet, who puts together or shows these constructions within certain parts of Tanakh, where you have a clear structure of, you have like 2 parts to a certain story, and they're equally divided. Equally doesn't have to mean the same number of letters or words, but closely about the same number. And you see that there's a parallel between A, B, C in part 1 and A, B, and C in part 2. And it's very fascinating how he finds these details. and they seem to be very convincing to me. And a literary analysis, from the point of view of literary analysis, it's something very different than something which seems to be just coincidental of how many words, and you put together the letters and you come up with something. But we had that discussion 2 weeks ago. When I mentioned 2 weeks ago, and we'll get to him more later on, Rav Mordechai Breuer, I mentioned that that when the Jews heard about Bible criticism starting in the 18th century, 19th, strong in the 19th, beginning of 20th century, of course, the Jewish reaction to it was to totally reject it, to refute it, to struggle against it, either to ignore it, which many did, says it's just nonsense, let's ignore it, or it's kfira, just go, steer away from it. Or there were those who challenged it, like David Zvi Hoffman, that's Hoffman in Germany, and others. And the unique thing is what's happening in the last decades, where we are picking up on some points of Bible criticism and turning it into holiness, turning it into Kedusha, turning it into a depth, a deeper understanding, a deeper comprehension, a deeper learning of Torah. And it's very beautiful in my eyes. And it goes back to the famous quote from Rav Kook, who says about challenges of Emunah, that we have to deal with them in a way that doesn't totally wipe them out. We have to grow above them. He calls it to build the castle of the Torah above them, meaning it pushes, it's like roots of a tree that are growing underneath the sidewalk and they're pushing the sidewalk up. That's in a negative sense. In a positive sense, pushing the Torah to a higher level of understanding, which is above the argument, above the challenge. And then when we're quiet because we don't have the challenge, it's not so challenging anymore, we can check it out, we can assess it. What do we take from it? What don't we take from it? Do we take from it 1% and reject 99%? Do we reject 1% and take 99%? But then it's without any fear or tension. And it's very beautiful for me to live in this time when we can already see how we can take beauty and depth of Torah from Bible criticism. But in order to understand it, we have to understand something about it. And as I was going through this and preparing today, I asked myself, am I ridiculing Bible criticism or not? I am certainly going to criticize Bible criticism. Am I going to ridicule Bible criticism or not? Because sometimes, basically, when these issues come up, I don't like to ridicule them. Ridicule them means that I'm not taking it seriously, that I think they're just, I think they're stupid people. I don't think they're stupid people. I don't really think that. On the other hand, some of the things they say, to be honest, I don't see what the basis is. It seems ridiculous to me. So I answered myself honestly that it's an open question. Maybe some things really are lacking in basis. I don't want to generally make a statement of ridiculing Bible criticism because I think there is certainly a certain percentage of serious data there that's good for us, that can deepen our understanding of the Torah. And there are challenges there, and we have to face those challenges. Some of them are seriously based. Of course, it can't be done haphazardly in a short shiur. And so we have to go back to it in a deeper way if we'd like to. But I'd like to today try and give a certain synopsis, a quick overlook of what it's about, and then to argue with it, and at the same time to take some good points from it. And I'd like to mention the history because the history is going to be important. So we're talking about people already in the 17th century coming to conclusions that the Torah was not written by Moshe and that it's all human and not divine from a divine source and things like that. And then in the 18th century, in 1753, you try to remember, it's not a history test, you don't have to remember the year. Let's remember 1750, okay? The middle of the 18th century. There is a French doctor named Jean Asteruc or something like that. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I see it in Hebrew. And he writes a book, which is theories of the different how do you say, tiudot, the different sources. The basic theory of modern Bible criticism is that the Torah is a compilation of a lot of different sources, different, what's the word?
Documents.
Documents that were then compiled, put together, stuck together by a reductor.
Mhm.
And he writes a book about Sefer Bereshit, the different theories. He himself says it's a theory. Theories about the different documents that Moshe Rabbeinu used, that Moses used to put together Sefer Bereshit. And he says Moshe didn't write Bereshit. He found different sources and he put them together. By the way, honestly, I don't see a problem with that. The question is, did Hashem tell him to do it or not? Not did he do it. Did Hashem tell him to do it? If there were, the Midrash says that the Jews in Egypt had, what did they do on Shabbat? If they were allowed to rest, they would tell the stories of Bereshit, meaning they had some basis. Maybe there were different sources. And Sefer Bereshit is what Hashem tells Moshe what to keep from these sources, how to put them together, what exactly I want to be in the Torah. So it's not so scary to begin with, but in any case, this is what he says. And he uses these, tell me if I'm pronouncing this word properly, using it properly, philological tools of analysis of the language of different chapters, the names of Hashem, all kinds of different, usage of different terms in different chapters, and he comes to a certain conclusions. Okay. So this is in the middle of the 18th century. We'll get to back, as I said, later on. I'm wondering when to mention it. I'll mention a little bit of it now. Chazal already noticed these things. Chazal made comparisons of language, of words in Midrashim, in Midrashei Halacha, in Midrashei Agadah, in comparing the names of Hashem in Perek Aleph and Perek Bet in Bereshit, in contradictions between different chapters and how we solve these contradictions. On the one hand, they seeked to solve the contradictions, to reconcile the contradictions so that they wouldn't contradict one another. Whereas Bible criticism says, if there is a contradiction between different chapters, that means these are different sources that were compiled together and they just left the contradictions as they are. And they didn't take notice of the contradiction. Maybe they didn't notice them. Maybe they didn't deal with them. But in any case, it's not totally new. Maybe Bible criticism sharpened it. Maybe they noticed more than what Chazal showed us in Midrashim and so on. But it's not that Chazal did not know that there can be contradictions or what seems to be contradictions in the Torah. And on the other hand, what we do see is that Chazal work to reconcile the contradictions and not to leave them as they are as contradictions. And Bible criticism says, well, that's because they're trying to put a patch on something which isn't working. It's an open sore and it's bleeding, and then trying to put a Band-Aid on it as if it doesn't exist, and really it does exist. So there's a difference of approach here, and this difference of approach will be very important later on. They continued in the 19th century. There were more books about Sefer Dvarim, and one of the important points of Bible criticism was that Sefer Dvarim is very different from the other parts of the Torah in the sense that it focuses on creating one center for Am Yisrael. It's the only book in the Torah where we hear about having Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. There is one place where Hashem will choose, and you will only be allowed to
Sacrifice.
to perform sacrifices. But I'm looking for the word pulchan.
Religious ceremonies, I guess.
Yeah, but we're both looking for another word. Pulchan. What's the word pulchan? In any case,
Sacrifices, I don't know.
in any case, you don't see this before. It's only in Sefer Dvarim. And then there are theories about Sefer Bereshit. So because of that, so they say this is a later reform in the Torah, putting in this new idea of having one center. And then they separate Vaikra and other parts of the Torah because they're very focused on the Mikdash and on holiness and on purity and impurity and details of laws and things like this. So they separate and cut the Torah up into separate sources. And they basically have 4 sources. One of them is called J, it has to do with the name of Hashem. One of them is called E, it has to do with the other name of Hashem. One of them is called D, is Devarim, actually it's Deuteronomy, which is the later book. They claim that that is what the Sefer Melachim tells us about, that they found a Sefer Torah in Beit HaMikdash
Right.
in the time of Yoshiyahu, which is the 7th century BCE. That was a whole, that Yoshiyahu made up the story, and he was the leader of this reform of creating this center and so on. And then we have a source which is called P, which comes from the word priest, which is the priestly parts of the Torah.
Right.
Now, first of all, the basis is, here's where I'm actually holding back not to ridicule it, because there must be a stronger basis than just this, because the fact that the Torah has, or other examples, there are parts of the Torah that are very storyish, and they picture Hashem in a very human form, whether it's physical form or feelings, anger, and so on, and envy, things like that. What's the word for that? They use for Hashem.
Jealousy or zealousy? Jealousy?
The word for picturing Hashem in
Anthropomorphic.
Oh,
right. What was it, Michael?
Anthropomorphic.
yeah.
Anthropomorphic, exactly. And then there are other parts in the Torah where you don't see that, and there are parts of the Torah that are about details, and I don't get the point. You're right. So it has to be different sources that are speaking of the story of the creation and the relationship between Hashem and human beings and God and Am Yisrael, and punishing and rewarding. That's one aspect of what God projects to the world, to human beings, and instructions and rules and demands with details is another kind of thing that Hashem projects to the world, and specifically to Am Yisrael. And one mitzvah can be a mitzvah of festivals outside of the Mikdash, and another part of the Torah can detail the laws of the Mikdash and the Kohanim. And you're so surprised that in Sefer Dvarim, which is the book of Moshe Rabbeinu separating from Am Yisrael before we enter into Eretz Yisrael, that's where we're going to hear about having one center, which is different than everything we've had until now. And this is going to be what Moshe is going to tell Am Yisrael to do when you enter into Eretz Yisrael. Bereshit was not the time to tell that to Am Yisrael. Shmot, when we're enslaved or leaving, and firstly building the Mishkan in the desert, when we're all living around the Mishkan, is not the time to tell Am Yisrael, to give Am Yisrael these instructions. So Sefer Dvarim is the time to hear about it. I can't bring scientific proof that this is all true, but to claim that it's scientific, that these are different sources and they were put together, I'm sorry. To me, that is totally lacking. That is not a good basis for these claims. If you find, and even if you find different terminology, that's natural, because the terminology that's going to be used in parts of the Torah that are about details of laws in the country is going to be different than the terminology that the Torah is going to use about sacrifices and purity and impurity in the Mikdash. Of course, the terminology will be unique for each part of the Torah. That doesn't mean these are different sources from different places and different times. It means that the Torah includes different aspects, using the name of Hashem differently. That's very significant. Does it mean that these are different sources, or that Hashem is so omnipotent, Hashem is so Ein Sofi, saying infinite? Okay, let's use the word infinite. Hashem is so great, so vast, beyond anything that, we cannot compare anything to Hashem. So of course we have to break it down into words that, first of all, are going to be, what's the word again, Michael? Anthropomorphic?
And throw.
Anthropomorphic.
Yeah, ascribing human characteristics to
Right.
that.
Of course, we're going to use those terms. Those are the perspectives, the tools that we have. And the names of Hashem will project that as well. It's not surprising. And yes, there will be Jews who will misunderstand that in different generations. There will be Jews who understand that Hashem has a physical being. And there will be Jews who think that Hashem gets angry like a human being gets angry and so on. But we don't have any other way of passing through this and being able to grow in our understanding as individuals, and maybe even throughout history, to grow in our understanding and our being able to make an abstract understanding of this terminology used in the Torah and so on. But it's not a reflection of necessarily different sources from different places and different times and someone compiling them together. It doesn't mean that at all. All I'm trying to say is, I can't prove that my perspective of the Torah is the right one, but to claim that this is scientific and this puts a challenge, puts a challenge in place to Jews who believe in the holiness and the godliness of the Torah, I don't see the challenge. It's not so challenging. On the other hand, it's giving me very good materials with which to deepen my understanding of the depth of the Torah. So I don't really see the difficulty. I understand that the Bible critics came to conclusions that the Torah is not God-given. But the fact that they reached those conclusions doesn't mean that I have to ignore the information that they're bringing me without accepting their conclusions about it. I'll take a break here.
So do you think that it's important to know what their motives were?
That's what I was going to say.
Okay.
First of all, we agree that some of them, at least some of them, there are different kinds of motives. You know, it's interesting. Some of them wanted to refute earlier claims that were heretic, like the Torah not being given by Moshe, and their refute of that was, no, it was Moshe who put together the different sources that were there in front of him. So sometimes their motives were even positive in a certain sense. But certainly some of them, their motives were anti-Semitic.
It was Christianity.
Motives were anti-religious in general, anti-faith. Yeah, but at the same time, I want to listen to what they're saying, because as I said, first of all, I want to build the palace of the Torah that is going to grow and elevate thanks to this challenge, through dealing with this challenge. And secondly, it's out there in the world. I think it's important today to deal with it and not to ignore it, because one of the experiences of yeshiva teachers is that I have students in yeshiva from age 18 to 20, 22, 23, and we teach them and they grow in Torah and so on. Then they go to the university and they haven't been exposed, and when they're exposed to this, they lose it all. So it's better that I expose them earlier and give them, it's like vaccinations, right? I give them at least 2 doses, maybe a 3rd dose of vaccinations, but beyond being vaccinations, I want to extract from this challenge the good parts of it that are going to help us grow and deepen our understanding of the Torah.
Right. But I want to add that we have to notice that the first critics of the Torah were Christians, and it was very important for them to put down the Torah and to make it human, given by humans, because that will elevate Jesus, and their way of thinking. I think that was very important to them.
I agree.
That doesn't make sense to me, because Tuvia Singer has been very good at taking what Christianity says about the Jewish Bible and kind of putting it in context. And he says over and over again that the Torah can be true and the New Testament false, but the New Testament cannot be true if the Torah is false. So if they're trying to show that the Torah was not really what we say it is,
But they
Why
based,
wouldn't that submarine their whole enterprise?
okay, yeah, it makes sense. If the Christianity is based on Judaism, on the Torah,
Yes.
then if you take this away, what does it stand on? It makes sense.
So
Well-
Rami, let me ask you about this idea that they're coming at this from a scientific, or I'd probably prefer the term intellectual, that the people that do this criticism stuff think that they are the intellectuals. And the opposite of that is that those of us who believe in the Torah are not intellectual, that somehow that's a childish thing to do,
Okay.
which I think is pretty insulting, but it makes it very difficult to take them seriously from our perspective.
I would just say that, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
So I'll get back to what I said before about motives. Why would they come at this way, other than to deliberately try to undermine belief in the Torah?
100%.
And I can understand, from what Tova was saying, in the early days, they may have been trying to weaken the influence of Judaism in the world and switch that to Christianity.
Right.
But in today's world, the Reform movement has totally adopted this.
Yeah.
They teach it as reality.
I would like to mention a few points, and Eliezer also wants to say something, so right after this. First of all, I'm asking myself about their motives. It's an interesting question. First of all, I think scientific developments have an aspect of curiosity, of analysis. There could be, I don't know to make the math of how much of it is anti-Semitic or pro-Christian, or how much of it is trying to be scientifically intelligent and honest and so on. But I can see people having an intellectual desire to analyze, like the literary analysis came up with beautiful things. And I'm sure that we have not seen the more challenging parts of Bible criticism. I'm sure that what I presented is only the tip of the iceberg, and there's more to it than what I presented. All I'm trying to say is that like I said before, I can't prove scientifically that the Torah is true, but I certainly as much don't think anyone can prove scientifically that the Torah is not true or anything like that. And the presentation as if it's scientific, natural sciences in that sense is a greater challenge because it comes up with some real stuff, some substantial findings. And yet we went through that. I'm not going back there. Yet there are issues to deal with, but there are also ways to think about the Torah where it seems that something's from natural sciences is contradicting the Torah, but here it's not science. It's it's analysis. It's a perspective, and I can understand that a person has a motive to try and put things in structure and notice rules and the way things work in the Tanakh and so on, and therefore I am interested. Honestly, not only because of my students who are going to go to university in a few years, I am honestly interested in what they're putting out because I want to see what it's about and how much of it I want to take and how much of it I want to reject. And I think there are going to be things for me to learn from it, to take from it, and I think that's going to be positive. But you don't have to take their findings and accept their conclusions. You can take their findings and just say, okay, but it doesn't mean what you made of it.
Right.
You found, I'll mention another thing. Part of their claim is about historical developments, that the Torah is not stagnant. It develops, it grows, it changes, it evolves over different time periods of history. And on the one hand, I can see that as part of the truth of the Torah. Different parts of the Torah, different realms of the Torah are stressed in different periods in history, closer to nature, closer to intelligence, and so on. So, but it doesn't mean that it's an all or nothing game. It's either Torah was once A, and then it turned into B, and then it turned into C, but the Torah includes A, B, and C, and at different times in history, A is stressed, other times B takes a more major place on the stage, and so on. And again, you can notice the information they're bringing in and analyze it, whether you accept it or not, but maybe there are good things to learn from it. I also want to relate to what you said, Michael, about, if they're intelligent and people believe in the Torah or not. On the one hand, there's something to be said for that. Not always intelligence is what brings Geulah to the world. On the other hand, I don't want to strengthen the direction that you need to be non-intelligent to believe in the Torah. And I want to give the younger generation and the older generation, but certainly the younger generation, the option of be an intelligent person, be a learned person, be up to date on the sciences in the world, including literature and philology and history, archaeology, and everything else. But give yourself the tools and deal with the challenges. And Adarabba, not only are you going to be able to deal with it from a perspective of Emunah, you're going to give other people the tools of how to put the two together. Because to reject intelligence in today's world is a problem. It's going to leave us. It's not going to put Torah in a good place. And I think it's important. And I think Chazal said it. There are things that we have to show intelligence within the Torah, like natural sciences. And that will make a Kiddush Hashem, rather than try and totally reject it, and we'll end up losing battles because of that. Eliezer, you've been waiting.
Yeah, actually, I have a lot to say, but I don't know if I'll get it out properly. First of all, I think that's a wonderful challenge that you're taking on yourself because it's extremely, extremely important for people to use all the sources they can to enhance the Torah. But I want to start by taking a very minor analogy, much lower level. But when I was a student, the accepted knowledge was that Shakespeare didn't exist. It was a cabal of playwrights because none of them singly could have presented all the masterworks that he did. Then later on, they said it was Sir Francis Bacon. I don't know. I don't understand that. Why? But the thing is, you look at the works of Shakespeare, and it's not the Torah, but they're so varied that it's really hard to believe that a single person could have accumulated all the resources. And he had his historian that he read to get the histories, and I've read a lot of Shakespeare because I think it's incredible stuff, and so Ad Rabbah, how can you have such a wonderful gift as the Torah? How can you just discard it and say, oh, it's so great that it's impossible that one person wrote it or something like that? It doesn't. Or that doesn't make sense. But then on the other hand, I want to, I have a very high regard for a lot of people who studied. On the one hand, it might be that a lot of people study it out of ego, that they want to prove how smart they are. But on the other hand, I know a lot of genuinely intelligent people, or a number, who take this extremely seriously, and such as my mother-in-law, and other members of the family, and also if you look at the faculty of Hebrew University, especially some people who just retired, there's some great Torah scholars there, and varying levels of religiosity, probably many of them from the conservative stream. But my mechutenista was the dean of Shechter, and when we discuss things, of course he doesn't say things that are going to upset me. But he has some very big insights on the Torah. So I think, your original point that there's a huge amount to be learned from these people, even if you take a different point of view. I think that that's really an important idea. And I would go even one step further. I would say that the world is created with people of all different beliefs because it helps to develop understanding that perhaps if there were only datim, it would be harder to reach this understanding. Even though the understanding should be dati at the end, I think that the world is varied partially for that reason. And to take it even one step further, perhaps, who knows, but perhaps the reason that there's no concrete archaeological evidence of Sinai is because if there were, it would be taken over, and the ability to develop our understanding of the world might be reduced by people saying, "Oh, we have the absolute truth," and not letting other people get at it. Okay, sorry.
I'm just going to relate to what you said in the sense of a lot of things go through processes and ups and downs in history, including Bible criticism. And later generations in the 20th century, some scholars took apart the division of Bible criticism, put it all together in a different way, claimed or put in the end of the 20th century, a few decades ago, with computers, they put some things into computers, and I'll be honest, some of the rules that Bible criticism seemed to find were strengthened by the computer checks that were made, and some were totally rejected by the computer checks, meaning it was that the language of the Torah was consistent even in parts that they claimed were different sources and different what did we call them before? Different documents. Scholars differ on these issues, argue over them. Jewish scholars have come into the picture in the 20th century. I mean, people like Yechezkel Koifman, like Kasuto, and others who rejected Bible criticism and were at the same time, modern intellectual people. And then there are people, just like there are Haredi atheists, if you know what I mean, meaning that there is a kind of atheism which is a total belief in a single truth. It's like they have their own Sinai, which of course is not Sinai, but there's something that was given to them from a God, meaning they don't believe in God, but somebody gave them a truth that if you argue with it, you're a heretic in their eyes in your disbelief of disbelief. So when I say Haredi in their attitude, meaning anyone who disagrees with me is totally wrong, is immoral, is everything else. And sometimes people are raised in a certain context of Hashkafat Olam, of Judaism, or of not Judaism, of Bible criticism, and they accept certain things as, like you said before, like the Ikarei Emunah of Bible criticism, and they don't question them. And this is the truth, not this is a way a certain group of scholars in a certain time in history understood things. This is the truth. This is the God-given truth about the compilation of the Torah. And sometimes they're not open to discussing it. So I'm not saying that the only ones who aren't open. Sometimes we're not open to discussing things. But you also have to be, I appreciate the people that disagree with me, but we can discuss things together openly and ask ourselves questions seriously and face them, and not, just like I want us not to shy away from questions. I would like, it's boring to try and talk to someone. It's also unpleasant to try to argue or discuss with someone who's not willing to question his Ikarei Emunah or Ikarei Kfirah or whatever. And so, sometimes the people are stuck in their ways in all different directions. But I agree with you. I'll mention something else that you said. I'm going to save it for next time. You mentioned that if there were only Datiim, we wouldn't have reached all kinds of points of refining of Emunah, I would say, or of development, growth of Emunah. I agree and disagree with that, but I'm going to leave that for 2 weeks from now. I'll have something to say. I wrote it down so that I will have something to say about that in 2 weeks. I wanted to mention also other examples. For instance, in Sefer Bereshit, there are 3 stories about a man who claims that his wife is his sister. Twice about Abraham, 3rd time about Yitzchak and Yaakov, Abraham and Sarah, twice Yitzchak and Rivka, and the 3rd time. Bible criticism sees them as developing from 1 to 2 to 3. And people who refute Bible criticism say it doesn't make sense. You don't repeat something for a second time if you're going to, why repeat it again and again and again? Unless it was there in 3 different sources and whoever put the sources together didn't notice, oops, I forgot that I already put it in source 1. It doesn't make sense unless there's a unique message in each one of the stories, in which case, without Emunah now, it can either be someone compiled these sources together because he was saying something by mentioning the story 3 times, or Hashem said to put the story in Sefer Bereshit 3 times because he was trying to say something to us. So what's the difference? So Dafka doesn't support the theory of the different sources, the different documents. I can't prove, I'm just saying it's certainly not scientific. It's not scientifically proven. It's a certain perspective. It's a certain way of analyzing things. You can agree with it or disagree with it. I don't think you can claim that this is, the intelligent people in the 21st century, going back to what Michael was saying before, if you're of the intelligence, do you believe in this? Intelligent people have different opinions and they argue about them. And it's not, this is the wise way to go. The same thing is a different kind of example, is that there are 2 places in the Torah where someone gives brachot to the 12 tribes. One is Yaakov at the end of Bereshit, and one is Moshe at the end of the Torah. And at the end of the Torah, there's something missing. Shimon is missing there. And so there are theories, what happened, and it's because in history, well, if you take Sefer Dvarim in the 7th century, at the time of Yoshiyahu, way after Moshe Rabbeinu, and Am Yisrael has been in Eretz Yisrael for a few hundred years, then you could say, well, Shevet Shimon didn't have their own separate land, and that's why he's not mentioned there by Moshe Rabbeinu. Or you could say Moshe Rabbeinu is giving a prophecy about the tribes, and Shimon was put down because of what happened. Remember what Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi? It wasn't so positive. It was very critical. It was very powerfully critical. And so Levi were saved from that fate of their act in Shechem because of their act in Chet HaEgel, and they became the Leviim. And they also don't have a place in Eretz Yisrael, but they have it in a respectful way, and Midrashim discuss this, and Shimon doesn't. So if you don't believe in prophecy, the only way to explain it is if it was written in the 7th century, so I have proven that it was written in the 7th century. But if you believe in prophecy, then you're saying, okay, so Moshe is giving us a fast-forward picture, looking on the one hand back from Yaakov until Moshe, how the 2 tribes of Levi and Shimon, what happened with them in the few hundred years of history since Yaakov until Moshe Rabbeinu, and looking forward, and maybe Shimon doesn't have a separate land or a very small, minuscule place and the fringes of Eretz Yisrael, and it's not worthy of being mentioned. So, what, again, did I prove prophecy? No. Did I disprove prophecy? No. How do you say I wanted to reach the conclusion, therefore I will prove that this is the conclusion? So, again, I'm not saying I proved the Torah. I'm saying that that it's not right to say that I proved the opposite. It's open to different interpretations, to different ways of analyzing it. There are different opinions, and to this day, scholars can argue about what parts of it are right and what parts of it are not right. I did not, again today, get to Arav Mordechai Breuer, but I would like to start what Arav Breuer is going to give us by mentioning the following. Remember 1753. There was a rabbi, 1753 is the year that Asteruk, the French doctor, put out his book about Sefer Bereshit. There was a rabbi named Reb Aryeh Leib ben Asher Ginsburg who lived in Belarus in the 18th century. He was born in 1695 at the end of the 17th century and lived until 1785. He died at the old age of 90, which is certainly not to be taken for granted in the 18th century. He lived from 1695 to 1785. He is the author of a famous responsa, Sefer Sheilot u'Tshuvot, called Sha'agat Aryeh. His name is Aryeh. His name is Aryeh. Sha'agat Aryeh is a lion roaring, the roar of a lion, and he calls his shoot Sha'agat Aryeh. And he analyzes Sefer Ezra and Divrei Hayamim, and he says there are discrepancies between different sources there. And he says the following. He says the author of Divrei Hayamim found different sources about the return of Bnei Israel to Eretz Israel and the beginning of Beit Sheni. And there were discrepancies between the different sources. And he quoted them all and left them in place. Sounds like Bible criticism to me. This is a rabbi, okay? A famed rabbi. Certainly no one since the 18th century or the 9th has raised any, any claim to not accept him as part of Jewish tradition. It sounds like Bible criticism. He's saying there were a few sources. He's not talking about the Torah. He's not talking about Chamisha Chomshei Torah. He's talking about the historical end of Tanakh, which is Ezra and Divrei Hayamim. And he's saying there were a few different sources that were there before the person, according to Chazal, it's Ezra, who was putting together the book. And he decided to leave all the sources and not decide between the sources. So it sounds like Bible criticism. But what Rav Breuer is going to claim is that this was call it a kind of a droplet sent from heaven so that we would notice different sources, discrepancies, contradictions within the Tanakh. And it was given the option of being developed b'kedusha, developed within the belief in the Torah. And we didn't pick it up. This was a one-time thing. A rabbi in the 18th century noticed this, mentioned it, and the world went on. And at the same time, some non-Jewish scholars, some of them may be anti-Semitic, picked it up and developed it in a way which was anti to Emunah in the Torah. And now what should we be doing? So Rav Breuer says we're going to get into this in greater detail next time. But just to give you the general picture of where we're going to be headed. Rav Breuer says what we should have done is we should have developed it within Emunah. We missed out on that. We're 200 years behind. It's time now to pick it up and return it, bring it back to Emunah. And he says if you take the neshama, you take the soul, you take the good point in Bible criticism, and you take it out and you develop that part of it, the rest of it is going to fall apart. What we have to do is not fight against Bible criticism and show how wrong it is. What we have to do is to take the points of truth. Maybe it's the kernels of truth. Maybe it's 50% of truth. That's another question. But we have to take the parts of truth that are within there in a way of emunah, and then the false parts of it are going to fall by the wayside. And we're going to get into that in a slightly deeper way and show examples of what Rav Breuer does. We'll have to wait for 2 weeks to do that. We'll do that in 2 weeks, Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very nice.
Very nice.
Thank you.
A quick question.
Yes.
I like the idea of studying the Bible criticism in order to help us sharpen our own understanding and our own arguments. to support belief in Torah and learn more from that. I would agree that arguing with those people is probably not very productive. And I was curious, have you come across anything where anyone who proposes Bible criticism has ever been induced to change their mind by logical argument?
It's an interesting question.
Doubt it.
I don't know the answer to the question because I'm not, that's not my social or vocational, surroundings. I don't meet them in my daily work. I'm more busy arguing with rabbis who I think are too far extreme, call them right wing and so on, who are causing damage within Am Yisrael and their extremism. Rather than being busy arguing with or meeting with or discussing with Bible criticism supporters. I don't know. I read about it. I read about the different opinions. And we'll get to archaeology, and I read about, they have in Israel, it's called the minimalists and the maximalists. Those who believe in the maximum of Tanakh, that it's all true, and those who believe that a very small part of it is true. And I can see their arguments, but I'm not part of their. It's not my social circles to argue with them.
Let me throw something out just to think about. I like what you said before about the idea of the Haredi atheists. The idea, and it strikes me that these people, by denigrating, if you will, the authority of the Torah, are trying to create their own religion. And that this is
an atheist religion, yeah.
Yeah. And I see this in pretty much the whole progressive movement today. They're not interested in constructing, they're interested in tearing down and being left in charge. And I think this, I don't know that that's the beginning of those people, but it's certainly part of that whole approach, that intellectual approach, or anti-intellectual approach is the way I would look at it. Because I see a lot of reflection in modern day from what you've been talking about here.
I will quote a post I saw recently, a post that said, "Lives matter. If you have to put any word before the words lives matter, you're a racist."
Exactly.
Lives matter.
Very good.
So, but I would say, in every group, you're going to have some people who are, so narrow in the way they see things, you can't talk to them. And it's not intelligent. And you will have people who disagree with you. So, so you're on two opposite ends, and yet you can discuss things with them intellectually. So.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Good week.
It's not nice for him.
I'm pretending on your behalf.
We're pulling him. We're giving him connections to Eretz Yisrael.
Bye. Good night. Bye.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Bye-bye.